When I first moved out of my parents' house, I thought getting a roommate would be the easiest way to afford rent. I had just graduated college and landed a starter job at a marketing firm in Chicago, but the pay wasn't great, and finding a decent one-bedroom apartment was out of the question. So, like most 20-somethings, I went scrolling through Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace, trying to find a place where I wouldn't have to eat ramen every night just to cover rent. That's when I came across the ad for a two-bedroom in Logan Square. The rent was cheap, suspiciously cheap, and the pictures looked decent enough. Hardwood floors, big living room, decent kitchen. The ad said the current tenant, a guy named Tyler, was looking for someone to move in ASAP since his old roommate had left suddenly. That probably should have been a red flag, but I was desperate, so I emailed him. He replied almost immediately and suggested we meet that same night to look at the place. I figured it was a good sign he was eager. I drove over after work, and the first thing I noticed when I got there was the building itself. It was old, brick, and kind of gloomy, sitting at the end of a quiet street with flickering street lamps. The apartment was on the second floor. Tyler opened the door before I even knocked, like he had been waiting right by it. He was tall, maybe 6'3", with messy brown hair and a scruffy beard. His smile was wide, but didn't quite reach his eyes. Still, he seemed friendly enough. He gave me a quick tour of the apartment, pointing out the kitchen, the bathroom, and the two bedrooms. Mine was the smaller one, but I didn't mind. Rent $650, utilities split down the middle, he said, leaning against the doorframe as I checked out the room. I just need someone reliable, someone who pays on time and isn't, crazy. I laughed and told him I could definitely handle that. We shook on it right then and there, and 2 weeks later, I was moving in. At first, things seemed normal enough. Tyler worked nights at a bar downtown, so we didn't see each other much. When we did, he was casual, maybe a little quiet, but not unfriendly. We'd watch TV together sometimes or share a pizza. He didn't ask many questions about my life, and I didn't pry into his. It seemed like an ideal situation, but little things started to bother me. The first was the smell. Sometimes when I came home from work, the apartment would have this sour, almost metallic odor. It wasn't constant, it would come and go, but it was strong enough to make me gag. I assumed it was old pipes or maybe something rotting in the trash, but no matter how many times I cleaned, the smell never really went away. Tyler never seemed to notice it. Then there were the noises. Late at night, when Tyler was supposed to be at work, I'd hear footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate, heavy steps that would move from one end of the apartment to the other. I'd tell myself it was just the neighbors, but our building was mostly empty. The walls were thin, though, and I kept convincing myself it was nothing. One night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of my bedroom door handle jiggling. I froze, heart pounding. I hadn't locked it, but someone was definitely trying to open it. I sat up in bed, holding my breath. After a few seconds, the sound stopped. I didn't hear footsteps walking away. It was just silence. The next morning, I asked Tyler if he had come into my room. He looked at me blankly and said, "Why would I do that?" Then he laughed like I had made a weird joke. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I started locking my door at night. Over time, I began noticing things missing from my room. Small stuff at first, spare change, a lighter, a phone charger. Then it escalated. One day I realized one of my shirts was gone. Another time I couldn't find my journal. I asked Tyler if he had seen it, and he shrugged. "Maybe you misplaced it." I wasn't so sure. The breaking point came about 3 months into living there. I came home early one evening because my boss let us leave after a slow day. The apartment was dark, and I assumed Tyler was at work. I dropped my bag on the couch and went to my room, but when I opened the door, I froze. Tyler was sitting on my bed. He wasn't doing anything, just sitting there, staring at the wall, holding my missing journal in his lap. My stomach dropped. "What the hell are you doing in here?" I snapped. He looked up at me slowly, like he hadn't realized I was there. His eyes were wide, unfocused. Then he smiled. "Just reading," he said softly. I demanded he get out, and for a moment I thought he wasn't going to move. Then, without a word, he stood and brushed past me. As he walked out, he muttered, "You write some interesting stuff." I felt sick. I locked my door and stayed up all night, wondering if I should just leave. But I didn't have money saved up. and I couldn't break the lease. From then on, things got worse. I'd hear him standing outside my door at night, just breathing. Sometimes he'd whisper things I couldn't quite make out. I started barricading my door with a chair. I barely slept. At work, I was exhausted, jumpy, constantly checking my phone. Then came the night I'll never forget. It was late, maybe 1 in the morning. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it again. The footsteps, slow, steady, moving closer to my door. I sat up, clutching my phone. The handle jiggled, then stopped. And then a whisper, "I know you're awake." I froze. My whole body went cold. The next sound was the creak of wood, and I realized he was pressing against the door, testing the barricade. My chair rattled, but held. I grabbed my phone and called 911, whispering to the operator that my roommate was trying to break into my room. Tyler must have heard me, because everything went silent. For a minute, I thought maybe he had gone back to his room. But then I heard the sound of something heavy dragging across the living room floor. When the cops arrived 15 minutes later, Tyler was gone. The apartment door was wide open, and in the living room, they found a kitchen knife lying on the floor. I filed a police report, packed a bag, and stayed with a coworker for a while. A week later, the landlord called me to say Tyler wasn't coming back. He had abandoned the lease. They never found him. I eventually moved into a different place with a different roommate, but I still wake up at night sometimes convinced I hear someone breathing outside my door. I think about how easily things could have ended differently if I hadn't blocked the door that night. The scariest part isn't what happened, though. It's not knowing what would have happened if he had gotten in. Story, the end. I just turned 24 when I found myself desperately searching for a new roommate. Rent was climbing faster than I could keep up with, and splitting the costs seemed like the only way I could stay in the city. I'd lived in Denver for a couple of years, working long shifts at a restaurant while trying to get a portfolio together for grad school. The place I had was nothing special, just a 2-bedroom in an older complex on the edge of town. It was boxy and bland, but it was safe and quiet, or at least it had been. I posted an ad online detailing the apartment, the price, and that I wanted someone around my age who worked or studied full-time. I added that I wasn't a big partier and valued a clean space. For a while, no one bit, and I started worrying I'd be stuck either moving or defaulting on rent. Then, after almost 3 weeks of silence, I got a reply from someone named Kyle. He said he was 26, worked at a shipping warehouse, and had just moved back to Denver after spending a year in Arizona. His message was short, kind of blunt, but he sounded straightforward. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop near the apartment. When I met him, I wasn't sure what to think. He was tall, maybe 6'2", lanky, with shaggy brown hair that hung a little into his face. He had a wiry kind of energy, jittery, like he'd had too much caffeine, even though he was only sipping water. His eyes darted around the cafe a lot, like he was checking the doors, the people behind us, the counter. But he was polite, told me about his work, and seemed genuinely interested in splitting a place quickly. He mentioned he didn't have much stuff, just clothes, some electronics, and a mattress. At the time, that didn't seem like a red flag. I figured he was just trying to start over. He moved in the following week. At first, things were fine. He kept to himself, spent long hours at work, and mostly ate fast food instead of cooking. I noticed he was pretty obsessive about locking the door. If I left for work and forgot to deadbolt it, even if I locked the knob, I'd come back to a sticky note saying, "Lock the deadbolt," in scratchy all-capital letters. At first, I laughed it off. Maybe he was just extra cautious. The first weird thing I remember happened about a month in. I came home late from a shift around 1 a.m. and saw him standing in the kitchen with the lights off. He was just standing there, facing the wall. It startled the hell out of me. When I asked if he was okay, he turned slowly, like he hadn't realized I was there, and gave me this half smile. "Just thinking," he said. Then he walked back to his room without another word. I shrugged it off, but it sat in my stomach like a stone. After that, I started to notice smaller things. He'd leave his door cracked at night, and sometimes I'd wake up to see him walking down the hall silently at 3 or 4 in the morning. Once I caught him sitting on the couch, lights off, staring at the blank TV screen. When I flicked on a lamp, he squinted at me and asked, "Why are you up so late?" as though I was the one acting strange. His room started to smell too, this mix of sweat and something metallic. I only realized what it was when he left his door wide open one day while he was at work. Against my better judgment, I peeked inside. He had almost nothing, just the mattress on the floor, a few trash bags of clothes, and a folding chair. But on the wall above his bed, he'd pinned dozens of pieces of notebook paper. Each one was covered in messy writing, words repeated over and over, like "don't sleep" and "they follow." Some had strange symbols I didn't recognize, almost like runes or coded scribbles. I told myself I'd imagined it, that maybe he was just working through some stuff. Everyone has quirks, but then he started asking me strange questions. One night, out of nowhere, he asked, "Do you ever feel like someone's watching you in here?" I froze, not sure how to answer. I said no, trying to laugh it off. He just stared at me, expressionless, and muttered, "You will." I thought about asking him to move out, but the rent had been easier to handle with him there, and I worried about confrontation. So I kept quiet. But things escalated. One night I woke up to the sound of my bedroom doorknob turning, slowly, gently. At first, I thought maybe I was dreaming, but when I sat up and looked, I saw the knob jiggle again. My stomach dropped. I didn't say anything, just held my breath, and after a few seconds, the noise stopped. I lay awake until sunrise, shaking. The next morning, I confronted him casually, asking if he'd been up late. He shrugged and said he had trouble sleeping. He smiled when he said it, but his eyes didn't. I started locking my bedroom door after that. Another time, I came home from work to find him in the living room, crouched on the floor, scribbling furiously into a notebook. He looked up when I came in, and I swear there was something in his expression that chilled me, like I'd interrupted him in the middle of something intimate, dangerous. He slammed the notebook shut and stood up so quickly the chair tipped over. "Don't come in without knocking," he snapped. I reminded him it was the living room, not his room, but he just glared at me and went into his room, slamming the door. Things went from unsettling to disturbing after that. I started noticing food missing, my leftovers, snacks I bought, even milk. At first I thought he just wasn't good at boundaries, but then I found something else. In the trash, buried under some paper towels, I found one of my socks, cut into strips. A week later, one of my t-shirts was gone. Then a framed photo of me and my ex disappeared from my dresser. I never brought it up because I didn't know how without making things worse. The breaking point came one night in November. I'd gone out with a coworker for drinks and came back around midnight. The apartment was dark, except for a faint glow under Kyle's door. I tried to be quiet, but as I passed his room, I heard him whispering. Not on the phone, just whispering. I leaned closer, thinking maybe he was talking to himself. What I heard made my skin crawl. He was whispering my name, over and over, sometimes with other words, but I couldn't make them all out. Evan, sleeping, watching, Evan. I froze there, listening, my pulse hammering. Finally, his floor creaked, and I realized he was moving toward the door. I darted to my room, locked it, and sat on the bed in the dark, listening. A moment later, I heard him try my door handle, softly, slowly. Then came a low chuckle, muffled but deliberate. That night, I didn't sleep. At dawn, I packed a duffel bag with essentials and went to stay at a coworker's place. I told Kyle I needed to go visit family unexpectedly. He didn't reply, just stared at me as I left, expression flat, eyes unblinking. I stayed away for 3 days, but I knew I had to go back eventually to grab the rest of my things. When I did, I brought a friend. Thank God I did. Because when we opened the door, the apartment reeked. It was dark, curtains drawn. Kyle's door was wide open, and his room looked ransacked. The walls were covered in even more papers now, all filled with writing, my name scrawled dozens of times among the mess. On the floor, there were piles of my missing clothes, some torn apart, some stained with what looked like old food, or something worse. But the worst part was on my bed. Someone had slid open the mattress, pulled out the stuffing, and inside the cavity were more of his notebooks, along with some of my things, my toothbrush, a pair of boxers, even that missing photo of me and my ex. It was like he'd been building a shrine inside my bed. I called the police immediately. By the time they arrived, Kyle was gone. He never came back for his stuff. They filed a report but didn't seem too concerned since technically he hadn't committed a crime beyond vandalism and theft. But to me, it was clear. He'd been escalating, watching me, fixating on me. And if I hadn't left when I did, I don't know what would have happened. I moved out the next week, breaking my lease and paying a penalty just to get away from that place. For months afterward, I'd jump at every sound, check over my shoulder whenever I walked home, and double lock every door. Sometimes I still wake up at night, convinced I hear a knob turning or someone whispering my name outside the door. I don't know where Kyle went. Maybe he's still out there in someone else's apartment, standing in the dark, whispering another name. Story, the end. It was January when I answered a Craigslist ad for a roommate in a small 2-bedroom apartment just outside of Columbus, Ohio. Rent was cheaper than anywhere else I'd seen, and the photos made the place look cozy. Wooden floors, big windows, a small kitchen. The ad was posted by a guy named Aaron, who described himself as quiet, clean, respectful, and friendly. That was exactly what I needed after moving out of a noisy dorm and trying to start over in a new city. We met at a coffee shop before I moved in. Aaron seemed normal, mid-30s, soft-spoken, almost shy. He worked at a local hospital as a technician, mostly night shifts, and said he spent most of his time at work or at the gym. His voice was steady, his handshake firm but not too firm. I told myself I'd lucked out. When I moved in, everything seemed fine. He helped me carry boxes, gave me the larger of the 2 rooms since he didn't need much space, and left me a spare key. I felt relieved, even grateful. The apartment had a faint, musty smell that reminded me of basements, but otherwise it was nice. For the first couple of weeks, Aaron was exactly as he described. Polite, quiet, almost invisible. He'd leave for work around 6 p.m. and can come home at strange hours, sometimes midnight, sometimes 4 a.m. When he was home, he kept himself in his room. I barely saw him, which suited me just fine. Then things started to shift. The first sign was my toothbrush. One morning, it was wet when I went to brush my teeth, even though I hadn't used it since the night before. I told myself maybe I was imagining things, but I bought a new toothbrush and kept the old one in my room just to see. 2 days later, the new one was wet, too. Soon after that, I started hearing noises at night. Soft footsteps outside my bedroom door when Aaron was supposedly at work. Faint whispers in the living room when the TV was off. Once, I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of my bedroom doorknob turning slowly. I sat up, heart pounding, but the door never opened. I confronted Aaron the next morning, trying to be calm. "Hey, have you been in my room at night?" I asked, forcing a laugh to make it sound like a joke. His face was blank. "No," he said flatly. "Why would I?" I dropped it, but unease settled over me like a fog. From then on, I kept my bedroom door locked, even when I was inside. I started keeping my valuables in my car just in case. A week later, I came home from work to find my bedroom window open, the cold January air streaming in. I never opened it. Too cold, too risky, but there it was, unlocked. My blanket was folded neatly at the foot of my bed, which I had not done, and there was a note on my pillow. Just one word. "Hi." I confronted Aaron again. "Someone's been in my room," I said. "Was it you?" He looked me straight in the eyes, his expression unreadable. "No one's been in your room," he said. "You should relax." I couldn't tell if he was lying or if I was losing my mind. I started sleeping with my phone in my hand, ready to call 911 at the first sign of trouble. One night, around 2:30 a.m., I woke up to the faint sound of breathing. Not my own, someone else's. I held my breath and listened. It was close, too close, like someone was standing right next to my bed. I fumbled for my phone, turned on the flashlight, and shined it around the room. The corner near my closet was empty. My door was still locked, but my blanket was on the floor, even though I'd been under it seconds ago. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I went out and bought a small camera to hide in my room. I placed it on my bookshelf, angled at the bed. When I got home from work that evening, I checked the footage from the night before. My blood ran cold. At 1:57 a.m., the door to my room opened slowly. Aaron stepped inside, barefoot, wearing dark clothes. He walked over to my bed and just stood there, staring at me while I slept. He didn't touch anything, didn't say anything. He stood there for over 10 minutes before leaving quietly, locking the door behind him. My hands were shaking as I watched it. There was no mistaking it. It was him. I decided I had to leave. I packed a bag that night and drove to a friend's house, not telling Aaron where I was going. The next day, I called my landlord and explained everything. They said they'd look into it, but they couldn't break the lease without proof. When I returned to the apartment to grab the rest of my things, the place felt different. My room smelled faintly of cologne, and the note on my pillow had been replaced with another: "You shouldn't have left." I didn't wait. I grabbed what I could and left. For the next few weeks, Aaron texted me from different numbers. "Come back. I miss our talks. You left so suddenly." I blocked them all. I filed a police report, but without a clear crime, there wasn't much they could do. Months later, I heard from a former tenant of the apartment. She'd found my post on a local forum where I'd warned people about Aaron. She said she'd lived with him too, and the same things had happened: missing items, notes, nighttime visits. She eventually left after waking up to find him standing over her bed, just watching. I've moved 3 times since then. I never rent from Craigslist anymore, and I never live with strangers if I can help it. Even now, though, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night certain that someone's in my room. Sometimes I swear I hear breathing just behind me or see a shadow slip away when I turn on the light. I've learned that horror isn't always a ghost or a break-in. Sometimes it's the person you trust enough to share a home with, the person who knows your schedule, your habits, your fears. Sometimes the danger is already inside, smiling politely, waiting for you to let your guard down. Story the end. When I first moved out of my parents' house and into my own place, I didn't really have much of a choice when it came to roommates. Rent was too high for me to cover alone, and none of my close friends were looking to move at the time. I was 23, fresh out of college, working a low-paying job at a marketing firm, and barely scraping by as it was. So I did what a lot of people my age did. I went on Craigslist and started browsing through listings. After a week or so of messaging people and touring some questionable apartments, I came across an ad that seemed too good to be true. It was for a 2-bedroom in a decent part of town, within walking distance to a bus line, and only about a 15-minute ride to my office. Rent was shockingly affordable compared to everything else I'd seen. The guy who posted it said he was looking for someone reliable, clean, and chill, and mentioned that the apartment was already mostly furnished, so I wouldn't need to bring much. The guy's name was Ryan. We exchanged a couple of emails, then texts, and finally agreed to meet. He seemed normal enough when we talked on the phone, quiet, almost reserved, but polite. I didn't get any weird vibes from him. When I went to tour the apartment, everything looked fine. The building was old, maybe from the 60s or 70s, with peeling paint in the stairwell and that faint, musty smell that lingers in places that haven't been renovated in decades. But the unit itself was clean, if a little outdated. Ryan had already decorated the living room with a big sectional sofa, a coffee table, and a flat-screen TV. He said I could take the bedroom on the left, which was smaller but still decent. I moved in within a week. At first, it was fine. Ryan kept to himself for the most part. He worked some kind of late shift. I never really got the details. Something in logistics, he said. He was gone at odd hours, sometimes out all night, and I'd hear him coming in around 6 or 7 in the morning, just as I was getting up for work. We didn't interact much during the first month except for polite small talk. He wasn't overly friendly, but he wasn't rude either. It wasn't until the second month that I started to notice things. The first odd thing was small. I'd come home from work and find my bedroom door slightly open. At first, I brushed it off, figuring maybe I hadn't shut it all the way in the morning. Then I started making a point of pulling it closed firmly every day before leaving. Still, every few nights I'd come back to find it ajar. Then I noticed food missing from the fridge. Not entire meals or anything obvious, just little things like a yogurt cup, a slice or two of deli meat, or a soda can I swore I hadn't drunk yet. I figured maybe Ryan was helping himself, but when I asked him casually about it, he shrugged and said he didn't eat my stuff. His tone wasn't defensive, just flat, like the question didn't matter to him. I didn't press it. The longer I lived there, the more I started to feel observed. Sometimes I'd be sitting in the living room watching TV and catch him standing in the hallway, just sort of lingering, not saying anything. When I looked up, he'd turn away and head into his room like nothing happened. He didn't do it often, maybe once or twice a week, but enough to unsettle me. About 3 months in, I had a friend from work over. A guy named Chris who came by to watch a basketball game. Ryan was home that night, and instead of keeping to his room, he sat on the edge of the couch, staring at Chris the whole time. He barely spoke, just kept watching him. At one point, when I went to grab beers from the fridge, Chris followed me into the kitchen and muttered, "Dude, your roommate's kind of intense." I laughed it off, but inside I was embarrassed and uneasy. That night, after Chris left, Ryan said something that still makes my skin crawl. We were both standing in the kitchen, and out of nowhere he asked, "Do you trust him?" "Trust who?" I asked, caught off guard. "Your friend," he said, his voice low. "You shouldn't trust people so easily. You never know what they're capable of." I laughed awkwardly and said something like, "Yeah, I guess that's true," before retreating to my room. But I couldn't shake the way he looked at me when he said it. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and it didn't feel like advice. It felt like a warning. After that, things escalated. I started hearing noises at night, long after Ryan should have been gone for work. Floorboards creaking in the living room, faint shuffling sounds outside my door. Once, even the distinct click of the bathroom door opening and closing. The first time I heard it, I assumed he'd come home early. But when I checked the next morning, his bedroom door was open and his bed was neatly made, like no one had been there. One night I woke up suddenly, heart pounding, with the sickening feeling that someone had been in my room. My closet door was cracked open, even though I always kept it shut. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I started sleeping with a chair propped against my door after that. I thought about moving out, but my finances were a mess. Breaking the lease would have meant losing my deposit, and I didn't have enough saved to get a new place right away. So I stayed, telling myself it was all in my head. Then came the night that confirmed everything. I'd gone out with coworkers and didn't get home until close to midnight. The apartment was dark when I walked in, and I assumed Ryan was at work. I turned on the light in the living room and nearly dropped my keys. Ryan was sitting on the couch in the dark, staring straight at the front door. "You scared me," I said, forcing a laugh. "Didn't see you there." He didn't respond. He just tilted his head slightly and said, "You shouldn't be out so late. Bad things happen at night." Something about his tone made my stomach twist. I mumbled something about being tired and locked myself in my room. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of my doorknob turning. Slowly, cautiously, like someone was testing to see if it was locked. I froze in bed, listening. The knob rattled once, then again, harder. The chair I'd propped under it scraped slightly against the floor as pressure pushed against the door. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, Ryan acted completely normal, making coffee in the kitchen as if nothing had happened. I didn't bring it up. I was too afraid of what he might say. Over the next few weeks, it only got worse. The attempted door openings happened more often. Sometimes I'd wake up and see shadows under my door, just standing there, unmoving, for minutes at a time. I took to sleeping with a kitchen knife under my pillow. The breaking point came in late October. I came home from work to find my bedroom door wide open. My dresser drawers had been pulled out, my clothes tossed around, and the contents of my backpack spilled onto the floor. Nothing was missing, but someone had clearly gone through everything. My hands were shaking as I confronted Ryan in the living room. "Did you go into my room?" I demanded. He looked up from the TV, expressionless. "Why would I go in your room? Because someone did," I snapped. "Don't lie to me, Ryan. This is messed up." He didn't flinch, didn't get angry, didn't defend himself. He just stared at me with that same unnerving blankness and said, "You should be more careful with your things. People might take advantage of you." That night, I packed a bag and slept at a coworker's place. I told the landlord the next day that I was moving out. Deposit be damned. I didn't care anymore. I just needed to get away. 2 weeks later, after I'd moved into a studio across town, I got a call from that same coworker, Chris. He sounded shaken. "Hey man, you're not going to believe this, but I saw something on the news. Wasn't your old roommate named Ryan?" My stomach dropped. "Yeah? Why?" Chris paused. "They arrested a guy named Ryan Parker last night. Cops found a woman tied up in his basement. He'd been keeping her there for weeks." I felt cold all over, my hands going numb around the phone. The face that flashed across the TV screen later that night was unmistakable. My old roommate, staring blankly into the camera just like he had at me so many times. I'll never forget the realization that I could have been next. Story, the end. When I was 26, I found myself stuck between jobs and desperate for a place to live that wouldn't empty what little I had left in my savings account. It was the summer of 2019, and I had just moved from Austin to Denver for what was supposed to be a stable position at a small tech startup. They folded 3 months later, leaving me unemployed in a city where rent prices were climbing faster than I could keep up. I picked up shifts at a hardware store while applying for new work, but I knew I couldn't stay in my apartment much longer. My roommate there, an old college friend named Rick, had gotten engaged and wanted to move in with his fiancée. He gave me a month to figure something out. I started scouring roommate listings: Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace, Reddit, every possible place I could find a room for rent. Most places were too far or too sketchy. But then, after nearly giving up, I saw an ad that caught my attention. Room for rent in Lakewood condo. Clean, quiet, $600 a month, all utilities included. Prefer male roommate, professional or student, no pets, no drugs, available immediately. The listing had 3 photos: a neat kitchen with white cabinets, a living room with a beige couch, and a small bedroom with a single bed and a dresser. The ad was posted by someone named Michael. I emailed him and got a response within a couple of hours. His tone was polite but short. He said he was 31, worked full-time as a night security guard for a local warehouse, and mostly kept to himself. He told me the last roommate had moved out unexpectedly to take a job out of state, and he wanted someone quiet and responsible. We arranged to meet the next day at a coffee shop near the condo complex. When I arrived, Michael was already there. Tall, lean, with neatly cut brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He looked professional, like someone who actually had his life together. He was wearing a gray polo shirt tucked into black jeans and spoke in this even, deliberate tone like he thought about every word before saying it. He told me he'd been living in the condo for about 3 years and preferred having a roommate mainly to offset costs since his mortgage had gone up. He didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't host parties. He said, "I work nights, so most of the time, you'll have the place to yourself." That sounded perfect to me. After seeing the condo, a clean, modest 2-bedroom unit on the second floor of a quiet building, I agreed to move in. We split the rent through Venmo and signed a basic roommate agreement he'd printed off online. By the next weekend, I was hauling my stuff up the stairs. The first few weeks were fine. Michael kept to himself, like he said. He left for work around 9 p.m. and came back around 6 a.m. I'd hear his keys jingling at the door right as I was leaving for work. He was quiet, almost unnervingly so. I'd sometimes find him sitting in the kitchen drinking coffee when I got home in the evenings, eyes half shut from working nights, but he was always polite. He'd ask about my day, talk a little about his job, then retreat to his room. But around the 3rd week, I started to notice small, subtle things that made me uneasy. The first thing was the locks. Every door in the condo, bathroom, laundry closet, even the pantry, had an additional lock on it. Some were newer deadbolts that looked like he'd installed them himself. The one on his bedroom door was especially strange. Not a standard privacy lock, but a thick, keyed lock, the kind you'd find on a storage unit. When I asked about it, he smiled and said, "I just like to keep things secure. You never know who might get access to a spare key in these complexes." That explanation made sense at the time. Then, I started hearing noises late at night. I'd be half asleep around midnight, and even though he was supposed to be gone, I'd hear faint footsteps in the hallway. Slow, dragging footsteps as if someone was pacing just outside my door. Once, I thought I heard the fridge open and close, then silence. When I asked him the next morning if he'd forgotten something before work, he just looked at me blankly and said, "No, I was at the warehouse all night." It became harder to shrug off after that. A few days later, I came home to find the door to my room slightly open. I always locked it when I left, partly because I had my laptop and some personal stuff inside, but also because something about Michael's behavior made me uneasy. When I unlocked and opened it, everything seemed fine at first glance. But then I noticed the top drawer of my dresser was open a few inches, and my clothes looked disturbed. My journal, which I always kept on my nightstand, was upside down and a page further along than I remembered leaving it. I didn't confront him right away. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it or just paranoid. But after that, I started taking pictures of my room before leaving each morning, just so I could compare things later. 2 nights later, I got proof something was wrong. It was just after midnight, and I was awake scrolling on my phone when I heard the faintest click at my door, like someone trying to turn the knob. I froze. Then came a light rattle, metal scraping against metal. The sound of a key trying to fit into the lock. My heart started pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. I didn't move, didn't breathe. After a few seconds, the sound stopped. Then came a whisper, low, muffled, right on the other side of the door. I couldn't make out the words, just the tone. It was Michael's voice. I waited until morning, barely sleeping, and when I came out, he was in the kitchen, dressed for work like nothing had happened. He looked up and smiled faintly. "You sleep okay?" he asked. I said I'd had a weird dream and left it at that. The next day, I bought a small motion-detecting camera and set it up on my bookshelf, angled toward the door. It was discreet enough that you wouldn't notice it unless you were looking for it. That night, I pretended to go to bed early, turned off my light, and waited. Around 12:40 a.m., I heard it again, the slow creak of the floorboards outside my door, the sound of breathing. Then, very softly, the knob turned. The door stayed locked, but I could see the faint shadow of his feet beneath the gap at the bottom. After maybe 20 seconds, the shadow moved away. The next morning, I checked the camera footage. Michael was standing at my door in the dark. He was shirtless, holding something in his hand, what looked like a small flashlight. He leaned close to the door, pressed his ear against it, and just listened. Then, after a long pause, he whispered something, too low for the mic to pick up, and walked away. I didn't even bother to finish breakfast that morning. I packed a bag, took the footage off the SD card, and left. I went straight to my friend Jared's place across town and showed him the video. His reaction was immediate. "Dude, that's not normal. You need to get out of there." I knew he was right. I called Michael later that day from Jared's apartment and told him I was moving out. He didn't seem surprised. He just said, "Okay, when?" "Tomorrow," I said. There was a long pause on the line, and then he said, "You should have told me in person." His tone was flat, but there was something in it that made my stomach twist. When I went back the next day with Jared to grab the rest of my things, the atmosphere in the condo was different. Cold, the blinds were drawn, and there was a strange metallic smell in the air. Michael wasn't home, or at least it seemed that way. His bedroom door was closed, locked as always. We started moving my stuff quickly. I had one last box left in my room when Jared called out, "Hey, check this out." He was standing by Michael's door, looking at the floor. The carpet outside his room had faint, dark stains, almost like something had been spilled there and half cleaned. When Jared bent down, he said, "This is sticky." I told him to leave it and grabbed my last box. As we were walking out, Jared noticed a small door near the hallway closet I hadn't paid much attention to before. It was low, maybe 3 feet high, with a padlock on it. "Crawl space?" he asked. "Maybe," I said, though I'd never noticed it before. When I finally got out and returned the keys, I thought that would be the end of it. But a few weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I checked the Lakewood neighborhood Facebook page to see if anyone had posted about that condo complex. That's when I found a thread that made my skin crawl. Someone had written, "Anyone remember the weird guy from Ridgeway Condos? The one who used to rent rooms to people and then they'd move out real fast? Cops were here last week. Something about a smell coming from his unit." Another comment followed. "Yeah, I heard they found something in his crawl space, like photos or something creepy. My cousin lives 2 buildings down." I kept scrolling until I saw a post linking to a local news article. The headline read, "Lakewood resident arrested after disturbing discovery in condo crawlspace." I clicked it, and there was Michael's photo. According to the article, a maintenance worker had entered his unit after neighbors complained of a strong odor. They found the padlock broken off the crawlspace door. Inside were dozens of personal belongings, phones, wallets, jewelry, notebooks from previous tenants. Some of the items were linked to people who had been reported missing in the area over the past few years. The police also found a small hidden camera installed behind a vent that looked directly into the spare bedroom. I recognized the vent from my old room. It was right above the dresser. The article didn't mention any bodies, but the tone of it implied there was more the police hadn't disclosed. The last line said that Michael was being held pending a full investigation. That night, I couldn't stop replaying everything. His quiet demeanor, the locks, the way he whispered through the door. I kept thinking about that low door by the closet, the one we never opened. Sometimes I still wonder if he ever came into my room while I slept, if he watched me through that vent while I changed or read or talked on the phone. I deleted the footage I had from the camera after turning it over to the police, but the image of him standing at my door stayed burned into my memory. That pale face, listening. I moved again a few months later, and to this day, I can't sleep unless every door and window is locked. I even put a small doorstop alarm under my bedroom door, just in case. I like to think I got lucky, that I left before whatever happened to those other people happened to me. But sometimes in the middle of the night, I'll wake up and swear I hear that faint rattle of a doorknob, and I'll remember the whisper through the wood. It wasn't a dream. Story the end. When I first met Ryan, he seemed like one of those guys who could get along with anyone. He had that effortless charm, quick smile, friendly handshake, and a laid-back energy that made people instantly comfortable. I'd just gotten out of a bad breakup and needed to move fast. I'd been staying on my cousin's couch for a few weeks when I found Ryan's ad on Facebook Marketplace. The rent was cheap, the apartment photos looked clean enough, and it was only a 15-minute drive to my new job at a print shop in Madison, Wisconsin. He said he was 27, worked at a car dealership, and had been living in the two-bedroom apartment for almost a year. The ad mentioned his last roommate moved unexpectedly for work, and I didn't think much of it. I met him the next day after work to check the place out. It was on the second floor of a quiet building near the edge of town, a little old, but kept up decently. When I walked in, I noticed right away how spotless it was. Not just tidy, like sterile clean. Not a dish in the sink, not a speck of dust anywhere. Ryan greeted me wearing a navy polo and jeans, his hair slicked back like he'd just stepped out of a work photo. "You must be Kyle," he said, shaking my hand with both of his, smiling wide. "Glad you made it. Come in, man." He showed me around, cracking jokes, offering me a beer, doing everything to make me feel comfortable. The bedroom he was offering was small but had a window and its own closet. He said the rent would be $650, including utilities, as long as I chipped in for internet and didn't mind alternating cleaning duties. "I'm big on keeping things organized," he said, gesturing to the spotless living room. "Not like a neat freak or anything. I just think a clean home makes for a clear mind, you know?" I nodded. At the time, it sounded reasonable, responsible even. I signed the lease 2 days later. At first, living with Ryan was fine. He was polite, considerate, and kept to himself. He'd wake up early, make coffee, head to work, and come home around 7. Sometimes we'd have dinner together, usually takeout or whatever he cooked. He didn't drink much, maybe 1 beer at night, and spent most of his free time on his computer or working out in his room. But after a few weeks, I started noticing little things that didn't sit right. For one, Ryan had a habit of leaving the door to his room cracked open, but I never once saw inside. The first time I accidentally passed by while it was open a little wider than usual, I caught a glimpse of the walls. They were bare, no posters, no shelves, nothing. Just a desk, a chair, and a bed. The blinds were drawn tight, even in the middle of the day. He also had this odd way of watching. Not staring in an obvious way, but I'd catch him looking at me from the corner of his eye while pretending to scroll on his phone, or standing just behind the kitchen doorway when I thought I was alone. Once, when I came home early from work, I found him standing in the living room, completely still, facing the blank TV screen. I said, "Hey man," and he jumped like I'd caught him doing something he shouldn't have. He laughed it off, said he was just zoning out, but it stuck with me. Then, the noises started. Around midnight, I'd hear faint scraping or tapping coming from the vent near my bedroom wall, the one that connected to his room. Sometimes it was rhythmic, like scratching or something dragging lightly against metal. I tried to ignore it at first, assuming it was mice or pipes, But the sound came too precisely, too deliberately. When I knocked back against the wall once, it stopped immediately. The next morning, Ryan was in the kitchen making eggs. He smiled like nothing was wrong and said, "You sleep okay?" I hesitated. "Yeah, fine. Just weird noises through the vent last night, maybe mice." He looked at me for a second too long before answering. "Yeah," he said softly. "Probably just the pipes." He smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of my door handle turning. It was subtle, like someone testing it quietly. My heart jumped. I stayed still, holding my breath. The handle moved again, slowly, like whoever was on the other side was trying not to wake me. I sat up and whispered, "Ryan?" No answer. I got up, flipped on my bedside lamp, and grabbed the small baseball bat I kept under my bed. The handle stilled. I took a deep breath, opened the door quickly, and the hallway was empty. But what unsettled me most was that Ryan's door was wide open now, his light off. In the morning, I confronted him. He laughed, acted surprised. "Dude, you must have been dreaming," he said between bites of cereal. "I didn't even get up last night. I was dead tired." Something about how casually he dismissed it made my stomach twist. After that, I started locking my door every night. The next week, things escalated. I came home from work one day to find Ryan sitting at the table with a notebook open. When I walked in, he quickly closed it and slid it aside. I asked what he was working on, and he smiled stiffly. "Just budgeting stuff." Later that night, after he went for his usual jog, curiosity got the better of me. I peeked at the notebook. What I saw made my hands go cold. Inside, each page was filled with neat, tiny handwriting, lists of names, dates, and random details. Some of the names I recognized, mine, our landlord, even the cashier from the gas station around the corner. Next to my name, he'd written things like left at 8:15 a.m., returned 5:47 p.m., the side, lights off 11:32 p.m. He'd been tracking me. I shoved the notebook back where I found it, heart hammering. When he came home later, sweaty from running, he greeted me like nothing was wrong. But his eyes seemed sharper that night, like he knew something had shifted between us. I barely slept. The next day, I asked one of my coworkers, Jen, if I could crash at her place for a few nights. I didn't give her details, just said my roommate was making me uncomfortable. And she said, sure. That evening, I packed a small duffel bag and waited for Ryan to leave. But he never did. He sat in the living room, scrolling his phone, TV muted. Hours passed, and every time I glanced over, he was still there, occasionally glancing toward my room. Around midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. I texted Jen that I'd come first thing in the morning. I locked my door, shoved a chair under the knob, and tried to get a few hours of sleep. At some point in the night, I woke to the faint sound of whispering. I froze. It was coming from the vent again, soft, muffled, almost like someone speaking right into it. My heart pounded as I leaned closer, straining to make it out. "Are you awake?" The voice was low, drawn out, almost playful. I bolted upright and grabbed my phone. I didn't answer. I just listened. The whisper came again, slower this time. "Why do you lock your door?" I couldn't breathe. My body locked up with pure fear. I didn't respond, didn't move. The whisper faded, replaced by a quiet chuckle, and then silence. I sat there until morning light crept through the blinds. I left that day without saying a word to him. Jen met me at a coffee shop nearby, and when I told her everything, she stared at me like she couldn't decide whether to believe me or call the cops. She insisted I stay with her until I figured things out. I agreed, but I needed my stuff. That afternoon, I went back to the apartment while I knew Ryan was at work. My plan was to grab my things fast and get out, but when I opened my bedroom door, I froze. Everything looked wrong. My mattress had been flipped, my clothes were dumped out of drawers, even the chair I'd used to block the door was gone. But what made my skin crawl was the smell, faint, sour, and unmistakably metallic. On my desk, there was a piece of paper. My name was written in neat block letters across the top. Below it were words scrawled in thick ink. "You shouldn't have looked." I ran. I didn't care about my stuff anymore. I got out, called Jen from the parking lot, and told her I was done with that place for good. She urged me to call the police, but when I explained that all I had was a creepy note and some weird behavior, she frowned. "You still need to report it," she said. I did. An officer came out the next day to take a statement. When I mentioned the notebook, he asked if I'd taken photos. I hadn't. The note was the only evidence I had, and even that I'd stupidly left behind. The officer said he'd do a welfare check and let the landlord know there was a dispute between tenants. That night, I tried to relax at Jen's, but every noise made me jump. The next morning, I got a call from the officer. He said he went to the apartment, but Ryan wasn't home. The landlord confirmed that Ryan's lease had been terminated suddenly. Apparently, Ryan had moved out overnight. Moved out. Overnight. That would have been the end of it. Except a few weeks later, I got a call from the same officer. He said they'd found something in a storage unit registered under Ryan's name. He wouldn't tell me everything, but I overheard him mention personal belongings from multiple individuals. When I pressed for details, he only said, "You should count yourself lucky, son." I never found out exactly what was in that unit, but sometimes I wonder if that faint metallic smell in my room had been from there. I changed my number, deleted my social media, and moved again 6 months later, this time into a small studio. No roommates. I wish I could say that was the end, that I never thought about him again. But a few months after moving, I came home from work one night and found an envelope taped to my door. No return address. Inside was a single piece of lined paper. In the same block letters, it said, "Are you sleeping better now?" I called the police again, but they couldn't trace anything. No fingerprints, no cameras, nothing. It's been 2 years now. I live in a different state. I have new locks, cameras, alarms, everything. But I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, sure that I heard a soft whisper through the vent, or the creak of my doorknob turning slowly. And every single time before I go back to sleep, I check that the door is locked, and I whisper quietly into the darkness, just in case he's out there listening. "Yes, Ryan, I'm sleeping fine." Story the end.